There was a chair. No one was allowed to sit on it. Not the king, not the queen, not the high priests, no one. It was not meant for sitting. It was something far more powerful than a throne. It was the soul of an entire nation. And in the year 1900, one man, a British colonial governor, looked at that sacred chair and said, "Bring it to me. I want to sit on it." 3,000 people died because of those words. This is the true story of the Golden Stool of the Ashanti, and the war that nobody taught you about in school. To understand why a chair caused a war, you first need to understand who the Ashanti people were. The Ashanti Empire was not a small tribe hiding in the forest. It was one of the most powerful, sophisticated, and wealthy kingdoms in all of Africa, located in what is today the nation of Ghana in West Africa. The Ashanti built an empire that controlled trade routes, gold mines and territories stretching across hundreds of miles. Their capital city, Kumasi, was described by European visitors as a city of extraordinary beauty, with wide streets, clean markets and architecture that stunned outsiders. The Ashanti were warriors. They defeated their enemies repeatedly. They were feared across West Africa, and they had something that no amount of gold or military power could replace, a sacred object that held their entire civilization together, the Golden Stool. According to Ashanti legend, passed down through generations, the Golden Stool was not made by human hands. It fell from the sky. In the early 1700s, the great high priest of the Ashanti, a man named Okomfo Anoche, called upon the heavens, and from the storm clouds above, a golden stool descended and landed softly on the lap of Osei Tutu I, the founding king of the Ashanti Confederacy. This was not a ceremony. This was not a ritual. This was a sign from the gods themselves, declaring, "This man is your king, and this stool is your nation." From that day forward, the Ashanti believed with absolute certainty that the Golden Stool contained the soul of every Ashanti person, the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. Every Ashanti soul, past, present, and future, lived inside that stool. This is why no one, not even the king himself, was allowed to sit on it. Sitting on the Golden Stool would be like crushing the soul of an entire nation under your weight. Even the king was only raised and lowered over it during his coronation, never touching it, never sitting on it. The stool was placed on its own special cloth. It was never allowed to touch the ground, and it was guarded with absolute devotion. Without the Golden Stool, there was no Ashanti king. Without the Golden Stool, there was no Ashanti nation. Now enter the British Empire. By the late 1800s, Britain was aggressively expanding its control across Africa. They called it the Scramble for Africa, a race among European powers to claim, colonize and control as much African land as possible. The Ashanti had been fighting the British for decades, not once, not twice, but 4 times, 4 wars between 1823 and 1896. The Ashanti were fierce fighters. They won several early battles, they humiliated British generals, but the British kept coming, with more soldiers, more guns, more resources. In 1896, the British finally captured Kumasi. They arrested the Ashanti king, King Prempeh I, and exiled him to the Seychelles Islands, thousands of miles away across the ocean. They occupied Ashanti territory. They imposed taxes. They seized land. But there was one thing they had not been able to take. One thing the Ashanti had hidden so well that no British soldier had ever found it: the Golden Stool. And this infuriated the British, because without the Golden Stool, they could not claim true authority over the Ashanti people. The Ashanti would never fully submit to a ruler who did not possess it. So in March of 1900, the British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Mitchell Hodgson, decided to solve this problem once and for all. On the 25th of March 1900, Governor Hodgson called a meeting. Every Ashanti chief, king, and elder in the region was ordered to attend. They came, they sat, they listened. And then Governor Hodgson stood up and said words that would echo through history. "Where is the Golden Stool? I am the representative of the paramount power. Why have you not brought the Golden Stool to me? The Queen's representative should be the one to sit on the Golden Stool. Bring it to me so I may sit on it." The room went completely silent. Not the silence of agreement, the silence of absolute, total, volcanic outrage. You must understand what he had just said. He did not just ask for a piece of furniture. He demanded to crush the soul of the Ashanti nation under his body. He demanded to desecrate the most sacred object of an entire civilization. He demanded to prove, in front of every Ashanti leader, that their people, their gods, their ancestors, their unborn children, meant nothing. The chiefs said nothing. They rose quietly from their seats and they walked out, and they went home to prepare for war. But the men hesitated. The chiefs gathered in secret, and many were afraid. Their king was in exile. Their army had been defeated before. The British had cannons and rifles. Some said, maybe we should negotiate. And that is when she stood up. Yaa Asantewaa, Queen Mother of the Eg Sioux, clan of the Ashanti, a woman in her 60s who had spent her life as keeper and guardian of the Golden Stool. She looked at the men around her and she said words that are still remembered today. "Now I have seen that some of you fear to go forward to fight for our king. Is it true that the bravery of the Ashanti is no more? I cannot believe it. If you the men of Ashanti will not go forward, then we will. We the women will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight until the last of us falls in the battlefield." The room erupted. Every hesitation burned away. Yaa Asantewaa appointed the war leader of the Ashanti. She became the first and last woman to ever lead a major African military campaign against European colonial forces. The War of the Golden Stool had begun. What followed was 6 months of brutal, bloody warfare. Yaa Asantewaa led her forces to lay siege to the British fort at Kumasi. The British inside were surrounded, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Governor Hodgson himself was trapped inside the fort. The Ashanti dug trenches. They built stockades. They cut off every supply route. The British were desperate. Hodgson eventually made a dramatic escape through the jungle, evading Ashanti forces, and reached the coast to call for help. Britain sent a relief force of over 1,000 soldiers from across West Africa. But the Ashanti were ready. They had set up fortified positions along every route to Kumasi, battle after battle, village after village. The British suffered heavy casualties at multiple strongholds. A second relief force of 1,000 men fought through to Kumasi in July 1900. Arriving just as the defenders were days away from running out of food. By September the Ashanti resistance was finally broken. But at what cost? More than 2,000 Ashanti warriors were dead. Over 1,000 British and Allied troops were killed. 3,000 lives, all because one man wanted to sit on a chair. And the British writer David Lloyd George later stood in Parliament and called Hodgson's demand, and I quote, something like the quest of the Holy Grail, a joke. They made it a joke. 3,000 dead. And to them it was a story. Here is the thing the British never understood. They won the war. They captured Kumasi, they exiled Yaa Asantewaa to the Seychelles, where she died in 1921 far from her homeland. They annexed Ashanti territory into the British Gold Coast colony. They won, but they never found the Golden Stool, not once. The Ashanti had hidden it, deep in the forest, in a location known only to a trusted few. For years the British searched. They interrogated people, they offered rewards. Nothing. And then in 1920, 20 years later, a group of African road workers were clearing land in the jungle, and they accidentally dug up something. The Golden Stool. Those workers, not understanding its full sacred significance, stripped some of the golden ornaments from it. When the Ashanti discovered this, they were furious. Those workers were put on trial by the Ashanti people themselves and sentenced to death. The British colonial authorities intervened and changed the sentence to exile. But here's where history turns. When the British realized what had happened, when they finally understood the depth of what the Golden Stool meant to the Ashanti, they made a formal promise. The Golden Stool would never be violated, never claimed, never touched by British or foreign hands. They gave the stool back. The Ashanti had lost the war, but they had protected their soul. In 1924, King Prempeh I returned from exile. He rode a special ceremonial train back to Kumasi. The streets were filled with thousands of his people, weeping, celebrating, singing. And in 1935, the Ashanti were formally given limited self-governance. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from colonial rule. And through all of it, through exile, through occupation, through decades of colonial domination, the Golden Stool survived. It still exists today. It is still the supreme symbol of the Ashanti people. It is still never allowed to touch the ground. It is still never sat upon. No one outside of the innermost Ashanti circle has ever been shown exactly where it is kept. British governor wanted to sit on a chair, and in doing so, he unleashed one of the greatest acts of resistance in the history of colonialism. He thought a chair was a chair. The Ashanti knew it was something the British Empire could never conquer, a people's belief in who they are. Yaa Asantewaa, the woman who chose war over surrender, 3,000 dead, one stool, one nation, unbroken. If this story moved you, if you learned something today that no history class ever taught you, then please like this video, subscribe to Pastra, and share this with someone who needs to know. Because history is full of stories like this, stories they buried, and we are here to dig them back up. Until next time. You've been watching Pastora, where history speaks, and the past was never really silent.